The dress was too simple for a night like this. Nora had known that from the moment her friend Sela finished sewing it, 3 weeks before, with cream linen thread and a modest embroidery along the hem. It was not the kind of dress that noble women wore at the banquets of Verein Castle. It had no velvet, no gold threading, none of the weight that came with the expensive fabrics imported from the southern cities. It was honest cloth, sewn by honest hands, for a woman who had never asked for much. But Sela had insisted. "You'll look beautiful," she had said, adjusting the collar for the 4th time, while Nora stood still before the polished metal mirror in the small room they shared in the servants' wing. "Dran will see you walk in and remember every promise he made." Nora had said nothing. She only looked at her reflection. 26 years old. Dark brown hair pinned in a simple braid. Amber eyes that always seemed to carry a weight she never explained to anyone. She was not ugly. She knew that. But she also knew that beauty without status, in the world of wolf packs, was worth little more than water in a winter rain. Draven Voss was the son of a Gamma from the Verein pack. He was not powerful, but he was enough. Enough for his mother to look at Nora as though she were a miscalculation. Enough for his brothers to cross their arms every time she entered a room. Draven had promised, 4 months ago, on a night near the riverbank when he thought no one else was listening, that at the packed banquet he would present her before the pack as his chosen companion. He had held her hand and spoken words that felt real. Nora had believed him. That was her mistake. The packed banquet was held once a year in the great hall of Verein Castle, when the packs of the region renewed their alliances before the entire court. It was the night when choices were declared, bonds were announced, and the wolf world reaffirmed its hierarchy beneath torchlight and dark wine. It was also the night when the Lycan King sent his representatives to assess the state of the packs. And according to the rumors that had been spreading through the village for weeks, this time it would not be only representatives. This time, the king himself would come. Nora had not thought much about that as she entered the hall. She was thinking about Draven. The great hall of Verein was impressive even for those who had known it for years. The rough stone walls rose to a vaulted ceiling where dark oak beams crossed overhead like the ribs of some ancient creature. Resin torches burned in iron brackets along the full length of the room, casting uneven golden light over the long tables covered with clay dishes, roasted meat, dark bread, and jugs of wine. The banners of the packs hung from the walls. The silver wolf of Verein, the black stag of Aldrin, the raven of Morthis, the closed fist of Sale. The smell of smoke, fat, spice, and the mingled scent of dozens of wolves packed into one enclosed space was almost overwhelming for someone with sharp senses. Nora kept hers carefully controlled, as she always did. She found Sela near one of the side columns, carrying a tray of wine cups to serve the nobles. The two exchanged a quick glance. Sela gave a subtle nod toward the center of the hall, where Draven stood among the men of his family, wearing a new tunic of dark wool, with the Voss crest embroidered on the chest. He was laughing at something one of his brothers had said. Nora breathed steadily. She walked toward him. Draven saw her at about 6 paces. The laughter faded slowly from his face, replaced by something she could not name at the time, but which she would recognize later as relief disguised as coldness. He straightened. One of his brothers crossed his arms. "Nora," he said. Just that. As though her name were the end of a sentence no one had started. Draven. She stopped at the right distance. Not too close, not too far. "You said we needed to speak before the ceremony began." "Yes." He passed his hand over the back of his neck. "Listen. Things have shifted a little." The noise of the hall continued around them. The torches kept burning. No one stopped to look, but Nora felt as though the space around her had grown narrower. "Shifted how?" she said. It was not a question. It was a line she was drawing between them. My father made an arrangement with the cauldrons. Dryan was not looking at her eyes. He was looking at some point above her shoulder. The youngest daughter of Gamma Cauldron. It's a better alliance for the family. You understand? I understand, she said. And she did. That was the most humiliating part. She understood completely. She was nobody's daughter. She had grown up on the edges of the pack, with no known father, with a mother who had died when Nora was 11. She had been raised by the irregular generosity of the pack and the constant hardness of her own effort. She had no status, no dowry, no name worth anything in that hall. What she had was a secret she had carried for 5 years, like a stone tied around her neck beneath the water. The ceremony begins soon, Dryan added, as though that were enough. One of his brothers said something low to the other. Both laughed. Nora turned her back on them before her face could show anything she would regret later. She walked toward the side exit, the one that opened onto the stone corridor leading to the outer courtyard. She was not going to cry in that hall. She was not going to shout. She was not going to do anything that would give the Voss family the satisfaction of becoming a story people told for years. She was nearly at the door when she felt it. A pressure in the air. Different. Heavy in a way that had nothing to do with the heat of the torches or the smell of wine. It was a presence, not of an ordinary wolf, but of something categorically above that, in a way that instinct recognized before the mind could form words. The hall grew quiet, in the way that large halls rarely do. Not complete silence, but the kind of silence that starts at the edges and moves inward when something enters a room, and those closest stop first, and then the others follow in a wave, like grain falling across a tilted table. Nora stopped too. She turned slowly. 3 men had entered through the main entrance of the hall. The first was broad across the shoulders, with close-cropped red hair and a grin that seemed to find amusement in everything around him, as though the entire world were entertainment created for his personal benefit. He wore leather and a short travel cloak still dusty from the road, as though he had not bothered to change before walking in. There was something deliberately provocative in the way he moved. The second was taller, with sharp features, and an ironic expression he made no effort to conceal. Dark hair swept to one side in a way that seemed too casual to be accidental. He surveyed the hall the way one studies a painting in a gallery, with clinical interest and a faint trace of aristocratic boredom. The third stood neither ahead nor behind the other 2. He stood at the center, one step apart, as though the space around him belonged to him by natural right, and no one had questioned that in a very long time. Black hair. Eyes that, from the distance where Nora stood, appeared nearly black as well. A thin scar running down the left side of his jaw. A dark mantle without excessive ornament, but whose heavy fabric and precise cut cost more than anything anyone in that hall possessed. He did not look over the crowd the way someone seeking recognition would. He simply entered, and the hall rearranged itself around his presence, the way water moves around stone. Roman Drav. The Lycan King. Nora recognized him the way everyone did. Not by his face, because few had seen it closely, but by the weight he carried without appearing to carry anything at all. And then, for a reason she could not explain, which should not have happened, which went against 5 years of careful and constant discipline, his eyes crossed the entire hall and found hers, directly, without hesitation, as though he had known exactly where she was. Nora felt something shift inside her, something that had been still for a very long time. Something that smelled of snow and forest, and a power she had learned to smother before she even fully understood what it was. She turned her back and stepped through the side door before anything inside her could do something that would change everything. But it was too late. He had already caught her scent. The corridor was cold. Nora pressed her back against the stone wall just outside the side door and breathed slowly, the way she had taught herself to breathe when the thing inside her pushed too hard against its boundaries. In through the nose, out through the mouth, counting silently until the pressure behind her ribs eased back into something manageable. The torchlight from the hall barely reached this far. Out here it was shadow and cold air, and the distant sound of the forest that began just beyond the castle walls. She had 5 years of practice at this. It had started the night of her first shift, when she was 21 and alone in the woods east of the village, because she had felt it coming and understood, with a certainty that needed no explanation, that no one could see what she was about to become. The shift had been violent and silent and extraordinary. She had lain in the frozen earth afterward and looked at her own paws. White, purely white, the kind of white that had no business existing on a wolf from a pack like Verraine, and understood immediately what it meant. White wolves were not common. They were not even rare in the ordinary sense of the word. They were the subject of old stories, the kind told in low voices near dying fires. Some called them sacred. Others called them dangerous. The elders of the larger pack said a white wolf had not been seen in the Northern Territories in over 2 centuries. Whatever the truth was, Nora knew one thing with absolute clarity. If anyone saw her shift, her life as she had built it, quiet, invisible, controlled, would end immediately. She would belong to someone else's ambitions before she could draw another breath. So she had hidden it. For 5 years, she had hidden it completely. She controlled her scent the way a musician controls breath. Constantly, unconsciously, with the kind of discipline that becomes invisible because it never stops. She never shifted near the pack grounds. She chose her moments carefully, deep in the forest, in the hours before dawn, when even the sentinels grew drowsy. She had become so practiced at suppression that sometimes, on the quieter days, she almost forgot what she was carrying. Almost. The side door opened behind her. Nora turned sharply, her hand pressing flat against the stone, ready to compose her face into something unremarkable. But it was only Sella, slipping through with her empty tray tucked under one arm, and her dark eyes already searching the corridor with the specific urgency of someone who had witnessed something and needed to report it. "There you are." Sella stopped a pace away and looked at Nora with the particular expression she reserved for moments when she was trying to decide how alarmed to be. "I saw Draven's face when you walked away." His mother looked pleased. "I wanted to find something heavy to throw at her." "Don't," Nora said quietly. I know. Sela exhaled through her nose. "Are you all right?" "Yes." "That's not what your face is saying." "My face is fine." Sela studied her for a moment, then leaned back against the opposite wall, crossing her arms loosely. She was 2 years younger than Nora, with warm brown skin and the kind of practical directness that came from having grown up with 4 older brothers in a household where sentiment was considered a luxury. She was the only person alive who knew about Draven's promise. She was also, Nora thought, probably the only person alive who would have sewn that dress with that much care for someone else's hopeful night. "The king is here," Sela said, her voice dropping slightly. Not from fear exactly, but from the specific weight that name carried. "I noticed. Everyone noticed. The alpha of Verraine nearly knocked over his own wine cup." A brief pause. "The king looked at you." Nora said nothing. "Nora, he looked directly at you, from across the entire hall. I was standing close enough to see it clearly, and I am telling you it was not a casual glance." "It meant nothing," Nora said. "I was near the door. He was scanning the room." "He was not scanning the room." Sela's voice was patient in the way it got when she thought Nora was being deliberately dense. "He found you specifically, and then you left. I had good reason to leave." "I know you did. I'm not arguing about Draven. Draven is a coward and his mother is worse, and the Cauldron Girl is welcome to all of that. I'm telling you something else happened in that hall, and you are standing out here in the cold pretending it didn't." Nora pushed off the wall. "I'm going back to the servants' quarters. The banquet will go on without me, and no one will notice. The king will notice, Selah said softly. Nora stopped walking. The silence between them stretched for a moment, filled only by the distant murmur of the hall and the sound of wind moving through the stone gaps high in the corridor walls. Go back inside, Nora said finally. You'll lose your position if the steward finds you out here. Selah did not argue. She picked up her tray, gave Nora one long look that communicated everything she had chosen not to say, and pushed back through the door into the warmth and noise of the hall. Nora stood alone in the corridor. She told herself to walk. To go back to the small room with the narrow bed and the cracked shutters and the single candle she rationed carefully through the cold months. To take off the dress that Selah had sewn and fold it and put it somewhere she would not have to look at it for a while. To sleep, if she could, and let this night become part of the long, quiet accumulation of nights that made up her life. She had taken 4 steps toward the far end of the corridor when the air changed again. It was the same pressure she had felt in the hall, but closer now. Much closer. And beneath it, cutting through the cold stone smell of the corridor and the distant smoke of the torches, was a scent she had no name for. Dark resin, iron, rain-soaked earth, and something deeper underneath that her wolf recognized before she did, something that made the creature inside her go very still in a way that was entirely different from suppression. This was not the stillness of hiding. This was the stillness of attention. She turned around. Roman Drav stood at the end of the corridor. He had not made a sound. She did not know how long he had been there. He was alone. No guards. No companions. Which was either the mark of a man who feared nothing, or one who simply had no need for protection in any room he chose to enter. Up close, he was larger than he had appeared across the hall. Not in an excessive way, but in the way of a man whose size was simply the natural consequence of what he was. The scar along his jaw caught the faint torchlight. His dark eyes were fixed on her with a steadiness that felt less like scrutiny and more like recognition. He said nothing. He simply looked at her. Nora held her ground. She would not step back. She had already walked away from one man tonight, and she would not make a habit of retreating. You left, he said finally. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not need volume to fill a space. I had no reason to stay, she said. You had every reason. He did not say it as a correction. He said it as a fact being placed quietly on the ground between them. The man who dismissed you made a significant error in judgment. I watched it happen. Something tightened in Nora's chest. Not because of what he said, but because of how he said it, without pity, without performance, with the straightforward clarity of someone who simply called things as they were. With respect, she said carefully, what happens between members of this pack is not a matter of concern for the king. No, he agreed, but you are. The corridor felt smaller suddenly. The cold felt different. Nora kept her breathing even, kept her scent locked down with every bit of the discipline she had spent 5 years building, and looked at the Lycan King standing in the shadow of a stone corridor in a castle that did not belong to either of them. You don't know me, she said. Not yet, Roman said. And for the first time, something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something quieter than that. But I know what I caught in that hall. And I know you've been working very hard to make certain no one else does. Nora's blood went cold. He knew, not everything. She was certain her suppression was too complete for him to have identified precisely what she was hiding. But he had caught something. A trace. Enough to know that what lay beneath her careful control was not ordinary. She said nothing. Roman took 1 step forward. Just one. Then he stopped, as though he understood that the space between them required her consent to cross. I won't press tonight, he said quietly. But I will ask you to remain in Verraine. There are things we need to discuss, you and I, in better light than this." He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the hall, unhurried, the dark mantle settling around his shoulders like something that had always belonged there. Nora stood in the corridor, long after the sound of his footsteps faded. Her wolf was no longer still. It was awake. Fully, dangerously awake, for the first time in 5 years. She did not sleep. Nora lay on the narrow bed in the servants' quarters, staring at the rough ceiling while the sounds of the banquet slowly died in the distant halls. The laughter fading, the music stopping, the heavy doors of the great hall closing one by one until the castle settled into the particular silence of deep night. Selah had come back sometime after midnight, read Nora's expression with the accuracy she always had, and said nothing beyond a quiet goodnight, before pulling her blanket over her shoulders and turning toward the wall. Nora was grateful for that. She needed the silence to think, though thinking was not quite what her mind was doing. Her mind was doing something closer to circling, returning again and again to the same point like a wolf tracing the edge of a boundary it cannot cross. Roman Drav's voice in the corridor, the steadiness of his gaze, the precise and unhurried way he had said, "I know what I caught in that hall." He had caught something. She was certain her suppression had held well enough to conceal the nature of what she was. 5 years of practice did not collapse in a single evening. But the white wolf carried a scent that was different in kind, not just in degree, and Roman Drav was not an ordinary alpha. He was the Lycan King. His bloodline was older than any pack in the northern territories. Whatever he had detected, it had been enough to pull him out of a hall full of nobles and follow her alone into a cold corridor. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the most dangerous thing that had happened to her in 5 years. She rose before dawn. The castle was quiet at that hour, the guards at their posts but drowsy, the servants not yet stirring in the lower halls. Nora dressed quickly in her working clothes, a plain wool dress of dark gray, sturdy boots, a heavy shawl against the morning cold, and slipped out of the room without waking Selah. She needed air. She needed the kind of open space where she could think without stone walls pressing in on every side. The eastern courtyard was empty when she reached it. The sky above the castle walls was the deep blue of the hour just before light, and the air smelled of frost and pine from the forest beyond. Nora crossed the courtyard and sat on the low stone bench near the well, pulling the shawl tighter around her shoulders, and allowed herself, for the first time since the previous night, to simply breathe without managing it. She was still there when she heard the footsteps. Not careful footsteps. Not the tentative sound of someone who was uncertain of their welcome. These were the steps of someone who had decided where they were going, and saw no reason to announce it differently. She looked up. It was not Roman. The man who came around the corner of the courtyard wall was the broad-shouldered one with the red hair, the one who had entered the hall the night before with that grin that found everything amusing. In the gray morning light he looked somewhat less theatrical than he had by torchlight, but the grin was still there, slightly reduced to something that might have passed for a friendly smile if Nora had been less cautious. He was holding 2 cups of something steaming. "You're up early," he said, with the tone of someone who was not remotely surprised. "So are you," Nora replied. "I don't sleep much in unfamiliar castles." He stopped a respectful distance away and held out one of the cups. "It's mulled cider. The kitchen woman took pity on me. I have an honest face." Nora looked at the cup, then at him. "Calder," he said, as though that resolved the question of whether she should accept. "I'm one of the king's seconds. The tall, irritating one is Fen. You probably noticed us last night." "I noticed," she said. She took the cup, mainly because the cold was genuine and the cider smelled of warm spice and apple. "Nora." "I know," Calder said simply, and sat down on the opposite end of the bench without being invited, in the manner of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that not everyone would invite him. The king mentioned your name this morning. Early this morning. Which is notable because Roman does not typically mention names before sunrise. Nora wrapped both hands around the cup and said nothing. You don't talk much, Calder observed without apparent criticism. I talk when there's something worth saying. Fair enough. He drank from his own cup and looked out at the courtyard wall for a moment. He's going to want to speak with you today. Properly. I thought it would be better if you heard that from someone who wasn't him, so it didn't feel like a summons. What does he want? Calder turned to look at her with an expression that was more considered than his easy manner suggested. Honestly, I don't know exactly. And I've known Roman for 11 years, which means I know that when he doesn't explain himself, it's because what he's thinking is something he intends to be certain about before he speaks. A brief pause. Whatever he caught from you last night, it stopped him mid-sentence. I've seen that happen twice in 11 years. Nora kept her expression steady. Inside, the wolf pressed against its boundaries with a restless urgency that she quieted firmly. Tell him I'll be in the Eastern Garden after the morning meal, she said. If he wants to speak, he can find me there. Calder raised his eyebrows very slightly, as though this answer had not been among the ones he expected. Then he nodded once, finished his cider, and stood. You know, he said, pausing at the edge of the courtyard, most people don't give Roman a location and a time like he's a merchant coming to show his wares. Most people probably spend a great deal of energy being frightened of him, Nora said. I don't have that energy to spare. Calder looked at her for a moment. The grin came back, but different this time. Quieter, with something genuine underneath it. No, he said. I don't think you do. He left. Nora sat with the cooling cider and watched the sky above the castle walls shift from deep blue to the pale gray of early morning. Roman arrived at the Eastern Garden exactly when she had said. She noted that, the precision of it. He came alone, without Calder or Fen, and he wore no formal mantle this morning. Only a dark tunic and riding trousers and boots worn enough at the heel to belong to someone who actually used them. Without the full weight of his formal presence, he was still unmistakably what he was. But there was something slightly less constructed about him in the gray morning light. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her without preamble. You controlled it in the hall, he said. Completely. The suppression was nearly perfect. Nearly, she said. Nearly. He held her gaze. I would not have caught it if I hadn't been looking for something unusual. The Alpha of Verain noticed nothing. Neither did his Gamma. Whatever you've been doing it for a long time. 5 years, she said, before she could decide whether to say it. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, exactly, more like a piece of information settling into a place that had been waiting for it. Since your first shift, he said. It was not a question. Nora felt the ground of the conversation become something she needed to navigate with more care. Why were you looking for something unusual? She said. In the hall. Before you saw me. Roman was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the bare branches of the garden's winter trees. Somewhere above the walls, a bird called once and went silent. Because 3 weeks ago, he said carefully, one of my oldest advisors, a man whose gift for reading bloodlines has never once failed in 40 years of service, told me that somewhere in the northern Pack territories there was a wolf whose nature had not been seen in over 2 centuries. He could not name the pack or the individual. He only said that when the time came, the scent would be unmistakable, even through concealment. Roman paused. He was right. The silence that followed was the kind that changes things. Nora felt it the way she had felt the shift in the air the night before, not as threat, but as the particular gravity of a moment that will not return. You cannot tell anyone what you suspect, she said. Her voice was quiet, but absolutely firm. I haven't, Roman said. "I won't. Not until you choose what happens next." She looked at him. He looked back. The morning was cold and the garden was bare, and the Lycan King was standing before her, offering her something that every powerful person she had ever encountered had instinctively tried to take. A choice, given freely, without conditions attached. She did not trust it yet, but she noted it. "Then we speak again tomorrow," she said. "And you tell me what your advisor said. All of it." Roman inclined his head once. "Tomorrow," he agreed. He left the garden as he had come, without hurry, without theater. Nora stood among the bare winter trees and felt her wolf move inside her, like something slowly waking from a very long sleep. The summons came before tomorrow arrived. Nora was in the castle's lower hall, helping Sela carry linens from the washing room when the steward of Varain found her, a thin man named Aldrich with a permanently pinched expression and the officious manner of someone whose small authority was the most important thing in his life. He stopped in front of her with his hands clasped behind his back and delivered his message with the careful neutrality of a man who had been told something he did not fully understand and was not certain he approved of. "The Alpha of Varain requests your presence in the council chamber," he said. "Immediately. You are to come as you are." Sela caught Nora's eye over a folded sheet. Her expression said everything. Nora handed her half of the linens and followed Aldrich up the back stairs. The council chamber of Varain Castle was a room she had never entered before. It was smaller than the great hall but carried a different kind of weight. A long table of dark wood, high-backed chairs, maps pinned to the stone walls with iron tacks, and a fire that had been burning long enough to make the room genuinely warm. The smell of candle wax and old parchment, mixed with the scent of several wolves in a closed space. Alpha Garrett of Varain stood at the head of the table. He was a heavy man in his late 50s, broad-jawed and gray at the temples, with the look of someone who had held authority long enough that he had stopped thinking about whether he deserved it. Beside him stood his gamma, a younger man named Price, whose eyes moved too quickly for someone trying to appear relaxed. Two of Garrett's senior warriors flanked the door, and at the side of the table, standing rather than sitting, with the particular stillness that Nora was already beginning to recognize, was Roman. Calder and Fenn were not present. That, she noted, was deliberate. "Nora," Alpha Garrett said, with the tone of a man using a name he did not consider important. "Come forward." She walked to the table and stopped. She did not lower her eyes. She had learned years ago that lowering her eyes in front of men like Garrett only confirmed whatever diminished opinion they had already formed. "You are pack adjacent," Garrett said. Not a question. The term was the polite version of what he meant. She belonged to the pack's territory and received its marginal protections, but held no formal rank, no blood claim, no standing that anyone was required to respect. No listed parentage, no rank, no formal bond. Correct? "Correct," she said. "The king has expressed an interest in your background." Garrett glanced at Roman as he said this, with the careful sideways look of a man trying to determine what the correct opinion was before committing to one. Given that, we felt it appropriate to conduct a formal assessment, a standard procedure for any pack member of uncertain origin when a matter of significance arises. Nora felt the shift in the room before she understood its direction. "What kind of assessment?" she said. It was Price who answered, and she disliked him immediately for the way he did it. Smoothly, with the practiced ease of someone delivering bad news they found privately satisfying. "A witnessed shift," he said. "Standard protocol under the pack accord when origin is disputed, and a senior authority requests clarification of bloodline. The king's presence makes this a formal proceeding. You are required to shift before this council so that your wolf nature can be properly assessed and recorded." The fire crackled. Someone outside the door coughed quietly and went silent. Nora did not move. She did not look at Roman. She kept her eyes on Garrett, because looking at Roman right now would tell them something she could not afford to tell them. "I am not disputing anything," she said, "and I have made no claim that would require clarification." "The accord does not require a personal claim," Price said. "It requires only a senior authority's request. The king has made one." Now she looked at Roman. His face was unreadable. Completely, deliberately unreadable. And that was its own kind of information. He had not arranged this. She could see it in the precise way he was holding himself still. The faint tension along the line of his jaw that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with a man who had walked into a room and found a situation he had not built. Garrett had moved quickly. He had used the accord before Roman could act otherwise. "If I may," Roman said, his voice carrying the even weight she was already learning to read, "this matter does not require immediacy. A witnessed shift can be scheduled. The accord specifies that when a formal request is made during an active assembly, assessment occurs within the assembly period," Price said, with the smoothness of someone who had looked this up recently and was pleased with himself for it. "The packed banquet assembly remains active until the king's party departs Varaine. We are still within that window." Roman looked at Price for a moment with the expression of a man filing something away for later. Price had the sense to stop talking. Nora understood the shape of it now. Garrett wanted to know what she was before Roman could make any move that gave her protection or standing. If she shifted here, in this room, whatever she was became Varaine's recorded knowledge first. And Garrett could use that however he chose. If she refused, the accord gave him grounds to expel her from packed territory entirely, which left her with nothing. 5 years. 5 years of careful, exhausting, unrelenting concealment, and it ended in a council chamber because a Gamma's son had broken a promise at a banquet. She breathed in slowly. She could feel her wolf inside her, not panicked, which surprised her. After a lifetime of suppression, she had half expected the animal to be anxious or erratic under pressure. Instead, it was calm, heavy and quiet and certain, the way deep water is certain of its own depth. It had been waiting a long time. It was ready. Nora looked at Alpha Garrett. "Very well," she said quietly. The space in the council chamber was not large, but it was enough. She stepped back from the table. The warriors near the door moved aside, not because they were making room for her, but because something in the air had shifted in a way their instincts responded to before their minds did. She had spent 5 years making this as small and invisible as possible. She had practiced suppression until concealment was the first language her body spoke. What she had never practiced, what she had deliberately avoided practicing, because practice required honesty, and honesty required acknowledgement, was letting it out completely. She let go. The shift was not violent. It was not the struggling, tearing thing it had been that first night in the frozen woods when she was 21 and terrified. 5 years of holding something tightly teaches you its exact shape, and when she finally released the hold, the change came the way a held breath finally releases, with the deep, physical relief of something returning to what it always was. The white wolf that stood in the council chamber of Varaine Castle was large, larger than a standard pack wolf, larger, in fact, than most wolves that Gamma blood produced. Its coat was the white of fresh snow in the hour after it falls, before anything touches it, pure and complete, without a single mark of gray or brown. Its eyes, which had been amber as a woman, were amber still, but brighter now, carrying a quality of light that had no simple name. The silence in the room was absolute. Garrett had gone the color of old ash. Price had stepped back against the wall without appearing to notice he had done so. The 2 warriors near the door were very still in the specific way of men whose instincts were telling them something their training had not prepared them for. Roman had not moved. He stood exactly where he had been standing, and he looked at the white wolf with the expression of a man who had been told something would happen and was now watching it happen and finding that knowing had not fully prepared him for the reality. His jaw was tight. His hands at his sides were open and still. Nora shifted back. It took less than a moment. She stood in the council chamber again, in her plain wool dress and worn boots, her dark hair loose from its braid, and looked at Alpha Garrett with the amber eyes that were hers in either form. The silence continued for a breath. 2. Then Roman spoke. "She is under the king's protection," he said. His voice had not changed in volume or tone, but something in it had shifted, the way the surface of water shifts when something large moves beneath it. Effective immediately. No pact claim supersedes that. No assessment, no recording, no accord provision applies to her further without my direct authorization. Garrett opened his mouth. "That is not a discussion," Roman said. Garrett closed his mouth. Nora stood in the center of the council chamber and felt, for the first time in 5 years, the strange and disorienting sensation of not having to hold anything back. It was almost too large to know what to do with. The room emptied quickly after that. Garrett left without another word, which was the smartest decision he had made since the previous evening. Price followed him, keeping his eyes carefully away from Nora, which told her everything she needed to know about how much of his boldness had been borrowed from the Alpha's presence. The 2 warriors went last, pulling the council chamber door shut behind them with the quiet precision of men who understood that whatever had just happened in this room was significantly above their rank to have witnessed. Roman remained. He did not speak immediately. He crossed to the fire and stood with his back to her for a moment, and Nora understood that he was giving her time to collect herself, to breathe, to decide what her face would do before he looked at it again. It was a small courtesy. She was surprised by how much it mattered. "Your advisor," she said finally. "What exactly did he tell you?" Roman turned from the fire. That the last recorded white wolf in the Northern Territories belonged to the bloodline of the Vareni, an old line, older than any current pack structure. They were not warriors in the conventional sense. They were something closer to what the old texts call anchors, wolves whose nature stabilized the packs around them, whose presence affected the balance of an entire region. He paused. The line was believed extinct. A massacre, 2 centuries ago. Political. The details are not pleasant. And your advisor believed a descendant survived. He believed the bloodline had not fully ended, that it had gone quiet, hidden, perhaps deliberately, and that it would resurface when conditions required it. Roman held her gaze. He was more right than either of us anticipated. Nora moved to the chair nearest the fire and sat down. Not because she was asking permission, but because her legs had made the decision before she did. The shift had not tired her. It never had, which was itself a deviation from the ordinary. But the weight of the last hour had settled into her bones in a way that required something solid underneath her. "I didn't know," she said. "About the Vareni, about any of it. My mother never told me anything about where we came from. She died when I was 11, and I had no one to ask after that." "What did she tell you?" Roman said quietly, not pressing, simply asking. Nora looked at the fire. "She told me to keep my head down, to work hard, to never let anyone see how strong I was." A brief pause. "I thought she meant it practically, the way any woman in a low-ranking position would mean it. Now I think she knew exactly what I carried, and she was frightened of what would happen if the wrong people found out. She was right to be frightened," Roman said. 2 centuries ago, the Vareni were destroyed precisely because what they carried was considered threatening to the pack lords who wanted unchallenged control of the Northern Territories. A wolf, whose presence naturally steadies and strengthens the packs around her, is either a very powerful ally or a very dangerous problem, depending on who is doing the calculating. "And which is she to you?" said a voice from the doorway. Both of them turned. Calder stood at the threshold, arms crossed, expression carefully neutral in a way that meant he had been listening long enough to know the shape of the conversation. Beside him, Leaning against the door frame, with his dark hair falling over one eye and his ironic expression dialed down to something more serious, was Fen. Roman looked at them for a moment. "You were supposed to be in the East Wing." "We were," Calder said. And then Price came past looking like he'd seen something that rearranged his understanding of the world, so we thought we'd come and find out what that was. He looked at Nora with the straightforward respect of someone who had recalculated and was comfortable saying so. "White Wolf, last of the Vareni line. That's not a small thing." "No," Roman agreed. "It isn't." Fen pushed off the door frame and walked into the room, stopping near the table with his hands in his belt. Up close, his features were sharper than they had seemed by torchlight, and his eyes were a pale gray that missed very little. "The problem," he said, in the dry, precise way of someone who went straight to the part other people were still working up to, "is that Garrett saw it. His Gamma saw it. Those two warriors saw it. You can keep them quiet with the King's authority for now, but word travels faster than authority in pack territories, and within a fortnight, every alpha in the north will know there is a white wolf in Varane." "Then she won't be in Varane," Roman said. The room was quiet for a moment. Nora looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means," Roman said, with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing each word before placing it, "that I am asking you to come to Dravenmore. My seat. Not as a captive, not as a ward, not as something to be studied or used. As someone under genuine protection with full standing, until we understand the extent of what your bloodline means, and you have had time to decide what you want to do with it." He paused. "The choice is yours. It will always be yours. But I will not leave you here where Garrett can find ways around my authority the moment my back is turned." Nora thought about the narrow bed in the servants' quarters, the cracked shutters, the careful rationing of candles through the cold months, the 5 years of holding something enormous and extraordinary inside a life built entirely around invisibility. She thought about her mother's voice saying, "Keep your head down," and she thought about the white wolf standing in the council chamber in the morning light, and she thought about the precise way Roman had said that is not a discussion, and closed Garrett's mouth with 4 words. "I need to speak with Sela," she said. "Before anything else." Roman nodded once. "Of course." She found Sela in the corridor outside the washing room, still holding the linens, because apparently the universe had decided that Sela would always be found holding something practical in the middle of extraordinary circumstances. Nora told her everything. She did not soften it or summarize it. She told it straight, the way Sela had always deserved to be told things, and when she finished, Sela set the linens carefully on the nearest bench and sat down beside them, and was quiet for a long moment. "The white wolf," Sela said finally. All this time. And you didn't tell me. I was protecting you. If you didn't know, you couldn't be held responsible." Sela looked at her with the expression she reserved for moments when she was deciding whether to be hurt or practical. She chose practical, as she almost always did, but Nora could see the hurt underneath it, and knew she would need to answer for that more fully someday. "Go," Sela said. "Go to Dravenmore, and write to me, or find a messenger, or somehow let me know you're alive and not being used for something terrible." "I will," Nora said. "I promise. And Nora." Sela reached out and took her hand briefly, squeezing once. "You were never nothing. You were always this. You just had to wait for the right eyes to see it." Nora left Varane 2 hours later, as the midday light fell pale and cold through the castle gates. She rode between Calder and Fen, who managed to argue companionably about the best road to Dravenmore for the full length of the outer village, without either of them winning, which seemed to be the point. Roman rode ahead, as she was learning was his way, not distant, but leading, always aware of exactly where everyone behind him was, without needing to turn and check. Dryan Voss was standing near the outer gate when they passed through. He had come out for some ordinary reason, she would never know what, and had stopped when he saw the king's party preparing to ride. He saw Nora among them. She watched the understanding cross his face in slow stages. The confusion first, then the recalculation, then something that might have been the beginning of regret, arriving far too late to be of use to anyone. She did not stop. She did not look away either. She held his gaze for exactly as long as it took to ride past him, and then she faced forward and did not look back. Dravenmore was 3 days' ride to the northeast, through pine forest and frozen river valleys, and the high pass that marked the edge of the northern territories. On the evening of the second day, when they had made camp and the fire was built, and Calder had somehow produced a pot of surprisingly good stew from a saddlebag, Roman came and sat near her. Not beside her, but close enough that the conversation was private. "My advisor's name is Edrin," he said without preamble, as though continuing something they had already been discussing. "He will want to meet you when we arrive. He is old and occasionally exhausting and always right, which is a combination that tries everyone's patience, including mine." "I'll manage," Nora said. "He'll ask you about your mother, about what you remember of her before she died." A pause. "It may bring up things that are difficult. Most true things do." Roman looked at her across the small distance between them. The firelight moved across his features, softening the scar along his jaw, and for a moment he looked less like the Lycan King, and more like a man who had been carrying his own weight for a very long time, and had learned to do it without letting it show. "You held that wolf inside you for 5 years, he said quietly. "Alone. With no one who knew what you were carrying." "Yes. That kind of discipline doesn't come from fear alone." He held her gaze. "What kept you going?" Nora considered the question honestly. The fire crackled between them, and the pines moved in the night wind, and somewhere in the dark, Fen was telling Calder something that made Calder laugh, low and briefly. "I didn't want anyone else to decide what I was," she said finally. "Whatever I carried, I wanted it to be mine until I understood it myself." She paused. "I suppose I'm still working on that part." "You have time," Roman said. "And the simplicity of it, no conditions. No urgency, no agenda visible beneath the surface. Settled something in her chest that had been braced for a long time." They arrived at Dravenmore on the afternoon of the 3rd day, riding through the great iron gates as the winter sun sat low and orange above the tree line. The castle was larger than Varane, darker in its stonework, built into the side of a granite ridge, as though it had grown there rather than been constructed. The pack that lived within its walls was the oldest in the northern territories, and Nora felt their awareness of her as she rode through. Hundreds of wolves registering a new presence, something unfamiliar and old at the same time, something their instincts knew before their minds could name it. Edrin met them in the inner courtyard. He was ancient in the way of men who have outlived every expectation anyone ever had of them. Small, bent slightly at the shoulder, with white hair and the sharpest eyes Nora had ever encountered. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he bowed. Deeply, with the full and unambiguous respect of someone who was not doing it for ceremony. "Vareni," he said simply. And something in Nora, something that had been braced and concealed and compressed for 5 years, something that had been carrying the weight of an identity she had never been allowed to name, finally, quietly, came to rest. In the weeks that followed, she learned the history of her bloodline from Edrin's careful records, piece by piece, the way you learn anything true. Slowly, with revision, and with the occasional sharp pain of understanding why certain things had been hidden. She learned that her mother had known exactly what she carried, and had spent Nora's entire childhood in quiet terror that someone would find out. She learned that the Vareni had not been destroyed as completely as the Packlords had believed, That one woman had survived, had hidden, had moved through generations under ordinary names in ordinary places, passing the bloodline forward in secret until it landed, full and undiminished, in a girl born in the servants' quarter of a minor Pax territory, with no father on record, and amber eyes that always seemed to carry more than they should. She learned, too, that Roman had known about the Vareni search for 2 years before that banquet, that Edrin had narrowed the territory, that Roman had come to Virain himself rather than sending representatives precisely because he had not wanted this handled by anyone who might misuse what they found, that his first instinct, upon catching her scent in the hall, had been not to claim, but to protect. That information took her longer to settle with than the history of her bloodline did. She told him so, one evening in the library when the fire was low, and Edrin had gone to bed, and the castle was quiet around them. "You could have told me that in the corridor at Virain," she said. "Yes," Roman said. "But you didn't trust me in the corridor at Virain, and you were right not to. Trust that comes before it's been earned is just hope wearing someone else's name." Nora looked at him across the library table. At the man who had said that is not a discussion, and closed a room with 4 words, who wrote ahead without needing to check that anyone followed, who had given her a choice on the first morning, and kept giving it every day since. "It's been earned," she said. Quietly, simply, the way she said things when she meant them completely. Roman held her gaze. Something in his expression shifted, not the controlled, unreadable stillness she had learned to read around, but something underneath it. Something he allowed to surface, because she had named a real thing, and real things deserved to be met honestly. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. Not a demand. Not a claim. Just a hand, offered and resting, waiting to see what she did with it. She turned her hand over and held his. They stayed that way for a long time, in the quiet library with the low fire and the winter pressing cold against the stone walls outside, and it was not a beginning exactly. They were already past beginnings. But it was the moment that everything before it had been moving toward. 6 months later, before the full council of the Northern Pax, Roman named Nora his bonded companion and the Lady of Dravenmore. The ceremony was held in the Great Hall, lit by 100 torches, with every alpha of the Northern Territories present. Edrin stood witness. Calder cried quietly, and denied it to anyone who mentioned it afterward. Fen wrote it down in the pack records with his precise handwriting, and allowed himself one small smile before closing the book. Sela arrived 2 days before the ceremony, having ridden the full distance from Virain with a single traveling bag and the expression of someone who had been waiting for an invitation and was quietly delighted it had finally come. Nora met her at the gate and held her for a long moment and said nothing, because nothing was needed. Dryan Voss heard the news when it reached Virain, as all news eventually did. He said nothing publicly. There was nothing useful to say. The white wolf ran free in the forests around Dravenmore from that winter onward, not in secret, not in the hours before dawn when no one was watching, but openly, in the full light of afternoon, across the snow-covered ground of the ridge above the castle. The pack saw her and knew what she was, and the steadying effect that the old text described was real, not magic in the dramatic sense, but the quiet, genuine kind. A sense of rightness that settled over the territory like the first snowfall of a season, covering everything evenly, leaving the world underneath cleaner than before. She was not the frightened girl who had hidden in the woods at 21, terrified of her own nature. She was not the invisible woman in the servants' quarters, rationing candles and holding herself so carefully that she sometimes forgot she was holding anything at all. She was Nora of the Vareni line, Lady of Dravenmore, bonded to the Lycan King. Not because anyone had decided that for her, but because she had walked through 5 years of silence and 1 night of fire and a cold garden in the early morning, and had chosen it, piece by piece, with her eyes fully open. The white wolf had been worth the wait, and the story, at last, was completely her own.